I'm going to assume most people know who Lot is. If you haven't studied this in a while, maybe you don't know all the details. But who is Lot? Abraham's nephew, okay. And he's going to leave Haran with Abraham. And when God gives this command to go, and there's some important details we want to kind of mention of why would he be with him? Why would he be leaving with him? So somebody want to read chapter 11, verse 31 there. 11 and 31. Okay, so Haran is a place, okay, Lot's father is a place, and also Lot's father, okay, so that can kind of be confusing. But why would Lot leave with Abraham? Why would he be traveling with him? There's probably two reasons, important reasons. Why would he be traveling with him? Look up in verse 28, might give you one clue. Remember Haran was who to Lot? His father, okay, so doesn't have a father, and then what about Abraham and Sarah's situation, okay, as far as their lineage or their heirs go? They don't have children. So it would be normal for him to go with him, that he didn't have a father, Abraham didn't have children. This is pretty important, I think, to notate here throughout leading up to Lot leaving, is that more than likely he was going to be Abraham's heir. That would not have been unusual, okay? Them not having children, they would adopt. We see Genesis is concluded with that, right? Where Manasseh and Ephraim are adopted, okay? And they get the full blessing of the other brothers, okay? So it would not be unusual for him to have been adopted and to be the heir. And it's very interesting to see that when he departs, that's when the promise gets more specific about Abraham's, going to be having specifically who his children are going to be. So the Messianic line is woven throughout the book of Genesis, right? We see the seed of Christ is woven throughout there. And God doesn't always pick the most likely person, right? Because who traditionally always inherits the blessing and the promises from the Father? The firstborn, right? Typically. Not the case in the book of Genesis. So there's really only, when we look through the book of Genesis and we see who inherits the seed and the promise, there's only two times that the firstborn gets those. Do you know who they are? One's easy because he is the firstborn. I guess he's not really born, but that one's easy. Adam, okay, and then who else? Kind of like an Adam. Okay, Noah. Okay, everyone else is going to be, they're either looked over or there's a unique situation. Remember, Isaac's chosen over Ishmael. Okay, Abraham was worried about him not receiving the promise and what would happen to him. Jacob's going to get the promise over Esau, even though he has some deception involved there. Okay, it's all part of God's plan. Judah's the fourth born. Okay, so we see that God often picks unlikely characters, right? From the very beginning. And then what about through the rest of the Bible? Okay, I often think like if I would have been in charge of picking the apostles, right? Like who would we pick? People are like, well, the guy who can speak 10 languages and he's a great public speaker and he dresses really nice, he has a perfect family. They were fishermen and tax collectors, and Paul was killing, not who we would, probably human beings typically would choose. That's one of the things I think that makes the Bible so unique as just a book, is that the characters, the protagonists are not always put in the best light, right? We get to see their flaws, their mistakes. And so we get to see that here with Lot and Abraham. And so one of the points I just want to kind of look at here is that he may have been considered the heir, which makes all this so much sadder when we see what ends up happening to him. It's not until he kind of rejects the promised land. So we want to pay attention to the progression of Lot's choices. So let's turn on over. We're going to read most of the passages where Lot and Abraham are mentioned together. So turn over to Genesis chapter 12. And then somebody want to read verses 4 through 5. 12, 4 through 5. Go ahead.
Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan.
Okay, so how are things going for Lot so far? They're going pretty well, right? So things are going good. He's with the right people. He's with the one who the promise was made. Things are going good. We're going to see each time they're mentioned together, we're going to see that things are going good. Okay, so I want to just kind of weave some application and lessons throughout the lesson. That way, if we don't get to all of them at the end, we'll kind of already made some application. So kind of early lesson. Lots of blessings come because his connection to Abraham and God's promises, right? It's because he's with him, right? The promise was not made specifically to him, right? It was to Abraham, and so he's along with it. Application we can make from that, I think, is many of our blessings flow from walking with people of faith, don't they? Mine do, from being with you all right here is a part of that, right? But we still, another application to make with that, have to develop our own faith, right? We see that, right? We just maybe piggyback off mom and dad's faith or grandma and grandpa because we just go because they make us. I saw that when I went to college, right? You kind of get out on your own and you're like, oh, I got to come up with my own ideas. I got to build my own faith, right? You don't realize that until you're kind of out on your own. And so with Lot, we see when he goes out on his own, there's kind of a true testing that's going to go on there when he's no longer with Abraham. And so we have to develop our own faith as well and keep in mind, who's the right people to be around that build us up, right? Or that can be the bad influence on us. Anybody, any other applications you can think of before we kind of move to the next point? Okay, very quiet in here. So. All right, let's turn over to chapter 13. So we'll read most of chapter 13 here. This is where they're going to split, okay? This is the fork in the road, essentially, right? So chapter 13, let's read verses 1 through 7, if somebody wants to read that.
Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So Lot is with Abraham. Okay, still things are going really well, but there's going to be a turning point here in the story. A couple things to point out, verses 2 through 3, just as you go through the story of Abraham, you see how unusually successful they are, right? And that's because of God's blessings, right? There's things they have that are just, you can't explain the amount of wealth that they had. And for them, where it mentions in verse 2 through 3, talking about having gold and silver, very unusual for them to have, a nomadic type people that are in the desert. Just again, points to God as the one giving these blessings. Lot's all a part of that. He's got these kinds of possessions too. And then this conflict arrives, of course, between the herdsmen here. And then we're going to see, this is kind of our first point we can make about Abraham, that he has this faith-filled solution to this in verses 8 through 13, if somebody wants to pick up the reading there, 8 through 13. Someone on this side, how about the right side?
So Abraham said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right, or if you go to the right, I will go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent, even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord.
Okay, thank you. So Abraham gives this Lot the first choice of the land, even though he doesn't have to, right? Remember, again, who's the promise made to? And this is his nephew, almost kind of like a son to him. Very easily could have said, quit the fighting, you're going this way, we're going over here, just told him what to do. But the note that we kind of had from our class that's really stuck with me, it says, in talking about Abraham, faith gives him the freedom to be generous. What does that mean? Faith gives you the freedom to be generous. in this situation. What do you think that means?
I think you faith. You have a lot of faith in how the situation is going to turn out for you.
Yeah.
In your belief in God's promise to you, you're really not worried about trying to give yourself the best or, try to force it to work out yourself. You should trust that what God promised to him is
Yeah.
going to be fulfilled.
God's in control of all of it, so it doesn't matter which way I go, right, Julie?
Faith also builds a spirit of integrity and a kindness in you that makes you to where you're not always looking for the best.
Yeah.
You
Yeah. That's a good point.
yourself because you're looking for the best for everybody around you.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
there's never an I in it. It's normally a, hey, I'll do anything just to not have this confrontation.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting when you think about, when you look at it from this angle that you're coming in here at, is that Lot, think about how sad that situation all is. You're looking out across there and this land is beautiful. And it'd be like looking out over a mountain and seeing this beautiful thing you could say and saying, I'll take that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what always looks so beautiful isn't.
You're going to see the motivations. Yeah, for sure. And I hope you see the love that Abraham had for Lot. Something that I never really keyed into until we went through this. At this point, he brings him with him. He lets him have this choice. We're going to see he has to go rescue him, something he didn't have to do. He gets caught up in a war. Then who intercedes for him to save this wicked city? Something he didn't have to do, But you see there is true, he has a love for his nephew, and cares about him. So God is in control. Doesn't matter what you choose because God's over all of it. Okay, and that's this powerful statement. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. Okay, that's something we can kind of lock in our mind to apply to so many things. Like, now it doesn't mean we just give away everything we own, right, or get taken advantage of in every situation. But there's so many times where like, does it matter? You go this way, I'll go. I'll take the other. So awesome contrast between faith and sight. Some of the things Julie was kind of mentioned there. And where they end up, Abram's going to end up near the altar of the Lord, and then Lot ends up near this ungodly city of Sodom. And so again, we see the language that's there is very similar to what was going on in the garden, okay? It's like, it's green, it's fertile, it's lush, you're looking with your eyes, all these things. So we really get from the language what's portrayed here of why he's choosing this. And there's this distinction made at the end between Abram he ends up back where the altar is versus where Lot ends up settling. And then we see that this is, as soon as they separate and Lot kind of turns his back on the promised land for the first time, then God comes in to be a little more specific about the promise, which as the promise is revealed, remember Abraham has so much faith, he just takes off. He doesn't know anything specific when he first leaves. And even still at this point, he doesn't have all the details right. He's told to go, and then he gets a little more until he, God tells him these big general things, but not so much the specific things. So as soon as he departs, we're going to see that he gets this renewed promise. So let's read 14 through 18. How about somebody on my left side? 14 through 18, if somebody wants to read that.
And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For the land which you see I give to you, and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord.
Okay, so you see verse 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord, and Lot had settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom, right? Then you contrast that with this last verse that Abraham ends up in Hebron and builds an altar to the Lord, okay? So we already kind of get an idea of their motivations here and that we can see. So again, after Lot departs, God reaffirms his promise with the land and descendants with Abraham. And really, like I said, I think we can kind of come to the conclusion that Lot would have been, and maybe not the full heir to Abram, but he was going to be like an heir. Anything that was his, we were already seeing that, right? That he was benefiting from that. But if he had not departed, who knows? I think things would have went really well for him. If we just kind of notice too the language, every time that they're mentioned together here, it really brings this point up in verse 14 about how after Lot had departed from him. We don't see this language again because when they're mentioned together, everything leading up to this, chapter 12, verse 4, Abraham went out forth as the Lord spoke to him, and Lot went with him. Okay. And then chapter 13, verse 1, and Lot went with him. A little further down, and Lot with him, right? So you always see there's a point made that they are together, and he gets the blessings from this. Now we see there's a clear kind of distinction that he's separated from him. They're no longer together. So things are kind of going to go really downhill from here. So some quick kind of application to check in with. Those who walk by faith can be great peacemakers by their actions. Think about that. Think about what Abram did to step in just for herdsmen fighting, really. There's strife amongst them. It was causing a family issue, But being a peacemaker, I think, is a very maybe underappreciated or underrated kind of Christian virtue, right? It's such a powerful, important thing, being a peacemaker, right? Is it mentioned, are we to be peacemakers today? Is that applicable to Christians today? Yeah, 100%. And think about times where there's a peacemaker maybe in your family, in this congregation, that you're like, man, if they hadn't been there, what would have happened? They were like the glue, They were rebuilding bridges. They were going to people, right? Bringing people together. That's an incredible, if you want to call it a talent or a skill, whatever it is, but there are people who are really good at it. And sometimes you may have that talent and think, there's nothing I can really do in service to the Lord. But if you have this ability, I'm not saying I'm great at it, but sometimes middle children, we're really good at that, right? Because we got to be the negotiators, right? My mom always says I was the negotiator. Because you know what it's like to be the annoying little brother, right? And then have the annoying little brother, and how cool it was when your big brother invited you to do something, and then you had your little brother, you got to invite him, right? So if you have any of those skills, you can develop them if you don't have them, right? It's maybe not, you could easily think of the opposite of what Abraham could have done, like, it's not my problem, like, this is all my land, figure it out, right? So you see now him separating, ultimately it did not work out for Lot, but he had every opportunity. He made these choices himself. But being a peacemaker is a very, very powerful thing. And then also those who walk by sight are often easily deceived and led into tragedy, right? That applies to us 100% today, right? Think about what are things that apply to us today. Maybe job. We're just thinking about, the money, the benefits, not what kind of people am I going to be working with? Am I going to have to miss Sundays? I've done that. I've had jobs, as a younger man where I just was like, well, I see how much they're paying was the first thing I cared about. Not that they need me to work on Wednesdays, okay? Money can be that way, right? I mean, financial things, right? That we're just worried about the physical things instead of what's involved, instead of walking by faith. Any other applications anybody thinks of so far?
Build upon what you were just saying. This is like a precursor to 1 John 3:15.
Yeah.
Lust of the flesh,
Yeah.
lust of the eyes, and the lust of the pride.
Yeah.
It's all three rolled into that one.
Yeah.
Who would have thought this far back in history would tie into that for us, but
And everything preceding this that I would imagine would have known about was the same kind of things. The fall in the garden, right? We can apply the same passage, okay? Think about what was going on in Noah's time, right? What were they worried about? The Tower of Babel. They wanted this great city to be renowned and all these kinds of things, right? So that's a common story, right? Where it's just we're motivated by what's in front of us and what we see. And somebody else say something over here.
Well, I think about Lot and see how beautiful that is, and as just like we've said, we see something beautiful, we move, and if we move to a new town, we see all these wonderful things, and it's a beautiful house and a great job. but there's not a church there.
Yeah.
He left that support he had,
Yeah.
that family he had to keep him faithful to God, and we, like you said, it's a precursor of what's going to happen to him. We're going to start a church, we're going to drive, we're going to do this.
I'll build my own altar when I get there.
Right, but as we get further and further away from family or away from God, it gets somewhat easier.
Yeah.
Like Sodom and Gomorrah, to give in to the pressure.
Yeah. Well, and I've always said too, when you have a void in your life spiritually, it's got to be filled. I think we are created that way. And if that void is gone, now what's it filled with? What's going on here in these cities in Sodom and Gomorrah? So we're going to see the consequences. This is a chapter that I think growing up, I just maybe never heard a lot, or maybe I didn't pay attention to or forgot about a lot of times. But chapter 14, Lot gets caught up in this war of the kings, okay? And I think it's an essential part of the story, and to me it really makes the story even a little more powerful. But he's now living in Sodom, okay, at this point. And he's going to be taken captive during this war. So if somebody wants to read, we're not going to read all of chapter 14, because not all of it applies to this, but let's read just verses 11 and 12 of chapter 14, if somebody wants to read that.
Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed.
Okay, so there's this war of the kings going on, and keep in mind, this is not that far removed from the flood. So they're more than likely, we don't know, but there's not millions or billions of people on the earth at this point, right? So when we think about kings warring, we might think of like movies we've seen, or there's like, tens of thousands of people, in these big, it's probably more than likely not what's going on here. It's probably more like we would think of like Viking culture maybe, or like Native American culture, where there's like a chief or a king over like maybe like 200 people, okay? Because there's a king in every city, it seems like, And so these kings are warring, and Lot gets caught up in that, right? We already see consequences of the decisions. And all of his stuff, his possessions and everything that he had. And so Abraham's going to rescue him here in verses 13 through 16, which I think we have time to read. Because I love this story. When you think about Abraham and, all the things that he had in his possession. But let's read 13 through 16, if somebody wants to drop down and read that of chapter 14.
Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and the brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus.
Okay, and then 16, read the next one too, please, sorry.
So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people.
Okay, so again, think about how unusual it would be for someone to have gold and silver and all these possessions. He has 318 trained soldiers. These aren't like shepherds that could wield a sword. This is enough to where he could hear about Lot, and he gets these men, and they lead like a planned attack at night and destroy these guys and bring everybody back. So we forget too some of the things Abraham was doing. He wasn't just this guy in a tent, with a bunch of camels. Like he led an incredibly, fascinating life as a sojourner. And so I think, again, noticing the love that he had for him, there is no hesitation. It's like in the same verse that they come and tell this news to him. Again, nothing that he has to get involved in. He doesn't have to go, kill people for just to, squash this beef between these kings. But as soon as he hears about it, he jumps to action. And then verse 21 through 23, let's jump down there and I'll read that. It's kind of a first interesting point to make about Abraham in this chapter. But in verse 21, we read about the king of Sodom. So he was part of this, right? So he really has no room to be negotiating at all, okay? He was not the victor in this thing. Abraham went and brought all these people back. So the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me, and take the goods for yourself." Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich." So he offers wealth to Abram, and it's funny too, because he lists first what he would get. It's kind of interesting. He's like, "Give me the people," right? He starts with the demand. This is a guy who has no room to be negotiating. He's like, "Give me the people, and you can take, and then you can take," you know. But he offers this wealth to Abraham, and he tells him about this oath that he wouldn't, you know, keep any of the Sodomites' possessions. And why is that? He states it here, but why? Why would he not want to be part of this? And what does that say about his character, especially in contrast to Lot? He doesn't even want to be associated with them, right? I don't even want people saying, "I took money from you," right? We could see that today. It's like a politician, oh, we find out they've been taking money from this company they invested in, or right now they're compromised. They have a little bit of maybe, you know, power over them, or it's like, oh, they took money from this terrible place. It corrupts them in a sense, right? We see that still today, I think. And so he didn't even want his name associated with them. Again, to compare to Lot, who was living there, right? Something I had a thought when of Lot being, you know, I have maybe a very vivid mind, a very wild imagination, but I like to like visually imagine what some of these scenes look like. I don't know if you guys do that. I hope the Bible is that amazing to you. You know, you're like, what would this have looked like? But I imagine this dirty old beat up, you know, Lot. How embarrassing this would be, right? He had all this stuff, like everything was going great. Then he goes off, and then he has to go save him. People died to bring more than life. I mean, they absolutely died. The people who had captured him, they slayed these men to get him back. So think about how humiliating this would be, traumatic, right? This would be like you're a prisoner of war, and then your uncle comes in and has to kill people to save you, and you're brought back. Like how traumatic that would be. Wouldn't this be the perfect opportunity for a wake-up call? Is all I can think. Like, okay, we tried out going to the valley, did not play out the way we thought. We're coming back to with Uncle, right? It would be, and he could have, right? There's no, we don't get anything, the indication that he had to go back to where he was out by Sodom, right? He by all means, he could have been back in the fold with Abraham. Go ahead.
What's even worse is after all these years, you still do this kind of thing.
Oh yeah,
You're almost ignorant to it.
yeah,
That you think, oh, I've got this.
yeah,
You know, I've got this. I'm gonna go out here. I'm gonna make these decisions. I'm not gonna put God first. And you just crash and burn.
yeah.
You know, and still after all these examples.
Yeah, that was literally when we were talking about the next point was just getting some application, and that's perfectly kind of what I was going to say is like we get wake up calls, right? All the time when we're maybe not living our life right, and in retrospect, they might have seen like, man, I don't know how to see that. Like that was I should have seen this. It was like a big flashing light, but we didn't see it. Or we see it with other people maybe, like, right? Sometimes it's easy. And sometimes we have to check ourselves before we're looking at everybody else's, you know, big wake-up calls. But yeah, we can take a lot from that of like, okay, when things aren't going right, we need to reassess, like, why are we doing this? You know, if you had really reassessed, maybe like he would have, like, okay, why did this happen? Like, when did this start going bad for me? Okay, you can maybe come up with some points that it was when I got away from godly people, when I got away from those who made this promise, right? And get out of around the wrong kind of people. You could kind of figure that out. But somebody have a point? No, okay, sorry, that's all I hand over here. But the next point, bad choices often put us in places where others have to rescue us. Isn't that true, right? We've probably been rescued. You ever been rescued out of, somebody helped you out of a bad situation? Or we have to rescue the others as well. And that choices affect others. We all know that, right? Sometimes we realize after the fact how our choices affected someone or how somebody else's poor choices are affecting us. And we can probably all agree to that, right? That our choices have affected others. What do we got? About 5 minutes perfect timing for where I ended, which if you've been in one of my classes, you know that is like don't nod your head. That's a rarity. I actually started out, I thought I'll do 2 different lessons on Sunday and Wednesday, but I was like, there's no way I'm getting through all this. And I was trying not to get to really the actual destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, so I didn't have to step on any of Steve's points because of what he's going to be talking about. So I wanted to end here, and then so for Wednesday, be prepared if you want to read. You can really, I guess, read where we're going to be leaving off. Just read Genesis 19 for Wednesday. That's going to be the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We'll read a little bit in Genesis chapter 18 where Abraham intercedes for Lot. But we're going to read really as much time as we spent today, we're going to spend that on Wednesday just looking at chapter 19 of the destruction and the results, the tragic results of that, which are going to involve Lot's daughters and his lineage. But, in case I forget to say this Wednesday, the seed of Christ will come through Lot, ultimately, right? There's some of his descendants will be part of that lineage. So it's not like he's completely, wrote off in the story. Because after we see chapter 19, he just disappears from the book of Genesis, right? We don't really hear we hear some things about him in the New Testament, he's mentioned, but not in Genesis. But all I could think about when I'd kind of gotten to this point, because we just taught the Proverbs class not that long ago, Steve and Jeff and I, and so a lot of those were on my mind of thinking about these forks in the road, right? And how people take different paths. Think about how many times in Proverbs we see these paths of wisdom that are talked about. I mean, it's just over and over. Not even in Proverbs. There's, in Ecclesiastes and other places too. You can follow along, but we've got about 3 minutes. I'll just kind of read some of these off to you if you can't turn as quickly. But Proverbs chapter 3, 5 through 6. Just think about these in relation to Lot and Abraham, okay? Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Okay, chapter 4, verses 14 through 15. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of the evil. Avoid it. Do not go on it. Turn away from it. Pass on. Could that not be the tagline for this lesson? Right? Because sometimes we start heading down the path, and we realize we're down the wrong path. And to give the analogy of like being on a bad trail, like maybe in the mountains, right? Sometimes you can't turn around. You've been, my mom and dad like to go to the mountains, there's some trails like you're on it, you're not backing up. You gotta finish it, right? And sometimes you get so far down it, it's like you just have to kind of do your best to get back on course, and it's going to be painful and difficult. But the best thing to do is avoid it, right? Do not go down it. So we say that and we say, well, okay, that sounds great. How do we do that? How do we know not to go down the path, right? Well, what's the answer to that? How are we going to know not to go down the wrong path? We won't know that every single time. Sometimes we just make mistakes that look like the right direction to go in our life, and we find out it isn't. What's the best way to not head down that path?
Lean on his understanding.
Okay. Study is a big part of that, right? And you're not going to have spiritual growth if we're not studying his word, right? And those things will be a little more obvious to us, like, oh, I know where this is going to lead, right? So those sound kind of vague, but that's really what it is, right? We have to study, we have to have spiritual growth. Being here, I think, being involved and being around the right kind of people is a big part of that. They can help us. Okay, still in chapter 4, verses 18 through 19. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. Chapter 14, verse 12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. I mean, there's 7 or 8 more of these, right, that are just perfectly fit with not only Lot and Abraham, but we can apply to our own lives too, right? That we've got to be aware. Sometimes things seem right to us. It seems like the best decision, but it isn't always. I think that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for all your attention. Like I said, if you want to be ready for Genesis chapter 19 on Wednesday, we'll be kind of finishing that up on Wednesday. So thank you guys.